Well, welcome everybody to the latest episode of Stars, Cells, and God. This is the show where we explore discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science and discuss how those discoveries provide evidence for God's existence, God's nature, and the reliability of Scripture. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I also work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. Reasons to Believe is the organization that sponsors this podcast. If you want to know more about Reasons to Believe, go to our website, www.reasons.org. You can also follow us on social media, RTB_official. And of course, last but not least, please go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, subscribe. You can get access to all kinds of great video content exploring a wide range of questions involving science and the Christian faith. And then, of course, use the notification button so that you can be reminded the next time a new episode of Stars, Cells, and God drops. Today, we're going to have a special edition of Stars, Cells, and God where we're going to explore the question, how does Christianity and how does Islam interact with science? Right? These are two of the world's great monotheistic religions. How do they interact with science? Where do they share common ground? Where do they display differences? And what really is the best religious perspective to adopt in light of modern day science? And I'm thankfully joined in studio today by Abdu Murray, who is trained as a lawyer, a Christian apologist.
Yep.
You head up an organization called Embrace the Truth, and you came from to Christianity from Islam. You converted from Islam to Christianity.
That's
so
right.
A great person to have to discuss this issue.
Very much.
And I also have an Islamic background as well. I grew up in a Muslim home. I have some sense of Islam, but I don't know that I would say that I'm an expert in Islamic theology. So I'm going to defer to you for the conversation.
Great.
But so thanks for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Fuzz, and always wonderful to partner with RTB in anything.
Yeah, and before I forget, I just want to make sure if people want to know more about you, your organization, the types of resources that you've produced, where can they go?
Well, they can go to our website, which is embracethetruth.org. We have the links to our videos on our YouTube channel and various podcasts all on the page. If you go to watch and read and listen, you'll get blogs and that kind of stuff as well. We have a YouTube channel. It's not Embrace the Truth because someone already took that. It's Abdu Murray Official. I didn't want my name to be on it, but I had no choice. So if you go there, you'll find our YouTube content as well. But podcasts, YouTube, and then embracethetruth.org.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's jump into it. And the first really question is this. It has to do with the worldview from a Christian perspective and worldview from an Islamic perspective, and which worldview gives the most robust framework for contemporary science.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who are watching this show are aware that it's oftentimes, I think rightfully claimed, that really the Christian worldview created a milieu in Europe that laid the foundation for the birth of modern science and ultimately the flourishing of modern science.
Yeah.
So, just for people to appreciate this, and you can feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
So there are certain things that the Christian worldview has with regard to nature that really are necessary for the presuppositions of science. So, for example, the creation is good, it's worth studying, right? That God is revealed through the creation. So studying the creation exposes us to God's fingerprints. God is provided for his creation through his providential care, or coming out of creation itself. That's a motivation for science and technology, right?
Yeah.
The laws of nature are constant, which is a critical presupposition in science. That human beings have the wherewithal to study nature and to learn from it because we're made in God's image. The creation is intelligible, right? So these are views of the creation that lead naturally to a framework that allows for science to flourish.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and not only is it motivation, but I also would say that there's that a related word, which is inspiration, which is the desire to go and look and see what God has done. You know, you probably know better than me, but there's that quote that's often attributed to Francis Bacon. It's that, "Oh God, as I study your world, I find myself thinking your thoughts after you," this kind of a thing, and it's like this sort of awe that sort of impels us to look into the world that God has made, and to be in awe of the one who indeed made it. I think about, those who study art history, or someone who studies even theory of art and how it works, and you get your PhD in this kind of a thing, and then you look at a Rembrandt differently than you would otherwise. You look at it and think, my goodness, the genius is actually more stark than if I didn't know anything about art. And so there's this effervescent delight that comes, I think, from studying God's creation. And it comes directly from God's word. It's not like it's just something that's planted in our hearts, which I think it actually is, but I think it's encouraged by God's word itself. And I think you find something similar in an Islamic framework. Now, there's some debate about that amongst Muslims, not the mainstream, but you do have people who sort of think that science and the delving into science is sort of an innovation, and it's dangerous to do it because you might come into conclusions that would contradict the revealed text of the Quran, for example. But that's an interesting view because it shuns sort of secular or seemingly secular ideas as you're trying to subordinate them or put them on par with the Quran and God's revealed will. And that's dangerous to do it. So some would be reactionary and say, don't even try. Just accept the way the world is and move along, which, of course, almost no one really does. I mean, even the most hardcore sort of revisionist or Reformation-type Muslims would still believe in medicine. And that's a scientific thing, and in scientific endeavor, they don't just like put poultices together and wish it was true or something. They actually engage in science. But when you look at the Quran itself, the central authoritative text in Islam, and there are several authoritative texts, but the central and most reliable to the Muslim authoritative text, you see all throughout the Quran itself where God called Allah. Allah just means the God in Arabic. Now, it is a reference to a specifically Islamic version of God, but Arab Christians all over the world, or even non-Arab Christians in some South Asian countries, refer to God as Allah, partly because of the Islamization of certain parts of the world, but it means the God, essentially. But the Quran makes specific and numerous references to signs. It's called ayat. God has done this as a sign to you. And who amongst you does not recognize God in his signs? Right. These are the kind of language the Quran uses. So it actually doesn't necessarily say you should look at and explore the world through scientific means. But what it does say is that there are, in the order of creation, signals about God's hand behind it all. And you're supposed to recognize that by recognizing what those symbols and signs actually are. So there is a certain affinity here where, and which shouldn't surprise us. I mean, if Islam, now Muslims would claim it's not derivative, that Islam is original, that everything else is derivative, that Islam is the original religion of Adam and Eve, for example, and it's been changed and corrupted into Judaism and Christianity. But let's take a historical approach and say Islam is an emergent religion that if not borrows from, very, very heavily develops from Judeo-Christian sources, the Torah, the Gospels, etc. And because it's a fiercely monotheistic belief system in a God who is personal, not an impersonal, absolute creative force, but a personal God, you would expect there to be similar views on studying the world that God had made, and a view on special revelation and general revelation, whether special through revealed texts and general through the revealed order of the world. So that's an affinity we actually share with the vast majority of Muslims, even based on their sacred texts. So that's, I think, a great point where we can talk about common ground upon which to come and talk about the differences, because there are significant differences. But this idea that the world can be known and can be discovered and reveal something about God and maybe who God is a point of common ground upon which we can come and talk.
Yeah. Well, and this is a question, and again, I'm asking this somewhat naively.
Sure.
Because, my understanding is that in Islam, Allah is capricious, right? No one can know the will of Allah, what Allah wills, right? There's the doctrine of abrogation. And the question then becomes, if that is Allah's nature, right? Then why would we think that the world would be predictable, right? I mean, that's one of the absolute central ideas in science is that what the world is today is what it was yesterday and what it will be tomorrow.
Yeah.
If that's not the case, science is impossible. And from a Christian worldview, there are clearly statements about the fixity of the laws of nature. But when those ideas are introduced, it's always in conjunction with the fact that God is reliable, that God is trustworthy, that God is unchanging, right? So a God who has those as his characteristics is going to produce a creation that would reflect that, right? Is that true in Islam, that God is capricious in the Islamic view, and how does that impact the reliability of the world around us, and what implications does it have for science?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think this goes into trying to understand that we need to be careful when we talk about labeling certain things, like God is capricious, Allah is capricious. But is he capricious through and through, or is he capricious in a certain aspect? So, and there's several sources of this. I quote it in one of my books of Islamic theology and some of the commentators on Islam who would say, just what you said, one of the important things to know about God is that you can't know about God except what he chooses to reveal to you in an extremely limited way. Now, I'm not saying that through a Muslim mindset the Quran is limited, but Muslims believe that God is so infinite. In fact, there was a big philosophical thing in the early days of Islam where can you actually describe God with attributes? Because if you do, then you limit him to human understandings of greatness or goodness or compassion or power. And so there was a whole thing on the via negativa. You can describe what God is not. God is not limited. God is not bounded. So there was this serious nervousness within Islam about, I don't want to define God, because if I do, even if he does it in his own revelation, I get nervous about that because I'm limiting him in some way. The capricious part is typically about God's will in terms of human beings and interaction, and the way in which God is not bound by a moral law, in other words. So if you do enough good things to get into heaven, by whatever standard that exists in Islam, God's prerogative is to not give you heaven. He can throw you into hell if he wants to, because he's not bound by this rule. Does that apply, though, to a capricious, a way in which the universe is unpredictable? One could argue, well, why not there too? And there's no place in the Quran where it says that's not the case. But in Islamic theology, Quranic sources, hadith, literature, all this stuff, you do have this sense in which God is unchanging because God has to be, because if God changes, then he's subject to things and things can affect him. Which I think is an unsophisticated way to look at that, but that's one of the worries. So he is unchanging. So you have these two competing things, right? He's capricious, but he's unchanging. Well, if he's capricious, then he can just do something and change his mind and all this. So there's a bit of a tension there. But how that affects the created order and the created world is that what he reveals to us, according to Muslims in the Quran, is a world that actually is, in some sense, established. So the Quran has a 6-day creation narrative. Now, there are some people who think that there's a contradiction between the 6 days and another area of the Quran where it suggests there's 8 days, but that's actually probably more of a grammatical thing, not necessarily an actual contradiction. But it describes us. How it describes it in terms of whether days means 24 hours or whatever, that's a familiar thing, right? it talks about the Quran talks about signs being established, like these are perpetual signs for you, that these are things that always exist, so you'll always know
Right.
that Allah is God. So in the text of the Quran, it's clear that things should be predictable. But in the theology of what we're talking about, there seems to be a tension with, but why?
Yeah.
Because if Allah's will can be whatever He wants it to be at that particular moment, why should it be predictable at all? But I think most Muslims rely on the text as opposed to sort of a speculation. Having said that, of course, as a Christian, I believe that I think science relies upon the predictability of the laws of nature and all these things. But we have to contend with the fact that, and Muslims would be okay with this, by the way, we have to contend with the fact that we don't always believe that. I mean, there's this one time this one guy rose from the dead, and they tend not to do that. And so we do believe that sometimes the order is interrupted, not in some capricious way, but it's interrupted by the one who is a master of those laws. So I want to be careful as to not say it's always predictable, but its predictability actually leads us to know whether something's a miracle or not, because it's the kind of thing that interrupts. And Muslims believe in miracles too, chief of which is the Quran, but they also have a bunch of miracle stories as well. So I'd say in a large respect there is a lot of commonality there, but I think with Islam that doesn't exist in Christianity is this tension between God's capriciousness and the inability to know Him through and through, and a revealed sense of order. In Christianity, you don't have that tension because you can know Him, and He is explicit about the created order being something that can be relied upon. And so there's a compatibility in the Christian faith where I think there's a tension in the Islamic view.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to be fair, I know a lot of Muslims who are scientists, who are engineers, very highly accomplished in those areas, very impressive in terms of their technical mastery. And of course, in the history of Islam, there's the golden age, where, I don't know, 700-800 years maybe, Islam,
a long time.
was, the Islamic scholars were developing some pretty impressive insights into the world across the board, across disciplines, many of which still live with us today, particularly in mathematics.
Algebra is named after Al-Jabr, who sort of developed the idea. There is some debate about whether or not the Muslims were trading on some of the Greek stuff and some of the some medieval thinkers, but the point isn't whether they invented it or not. The point was they were they expanded this kind of stuff, and a lot of them were innovators. I mean, we have one of the most powerful arguments for God's existence called the Kalam cosmological argument, and that word Kalam comes from the Arabic word word. Actually, the word Kalam means word in Arabic, and it's derived from this idea. And you can see some commonality here with the Christian faith, is that the Quran says that God merely needs to say something, be, and it is. So with a word, He can call something into existence. And that's how the universe is created, through the power of God's word, as it were. Now, what word means exactly, of course, is a bit of a mystery, but we can understand this. And of course, we can say, and God said, let there be light, and God said, and God said. So the powerful argument of the Kalam was popularized and really developed by Al-Ghazali. These folks are the ones these Muslim thinkers were the ones who popularized these ideas. And Ghazali had very sophisticated ideas on the views of infinity. Like the reason why he actually can come to the conclusion that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And he actually, in a sophisticated way, responded to some of the detractors who were saying, well, can't it just have an infinite number of regresses? Well, you have infinite number of things in the past. And Ghazali brilliantly said, no, because we have a now. No one doubts that now exists. If you have an infinite number of instances in the past, then that means you can never start counting to now, because there's an infinite number in the past. And so it's actually ridiculous to think of an actual infinite series of events in a temporal sense
Yeah.
because you can never get to now. But here we are. So these are the kind of sophisticated levels of thinking. Now, is that science? It's more philosophy. But science is baked into that whole thing.
Right.
And so you have some really sophisticated arguments that were developed, and they've stood the test of time. That argument has lasted centuries, and it lasts today. It's one of the most powerful arguments we have today for God's existence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, just in your opinion, what led to the kind of the waning of science in Islam?
Yeah.
You know,
And there is some scholarship on this where there was this fear, because one of the big fears in Islam is the idea of innovation. So whenever you do Quranic commentary, which is called tafsir. Tafsir is just like we do commentaries and we have biblical scholarship on passages and what they mean and all that stuff. Muslims do the same thing with the Quran. And one of the big worries about this and the things you're constantly terrified of, frankly, is what's called innovation, where you either interpret the Quran wrongly and therefore create some doctrine that isn't necessarily orthodox, or you rely on other sources to inform you about what the Quran actually means. And that's innovation too, because that other source, let's say it's science. So let's say there's some discovery or some scientific view on something, and you say, see, that proves what the Quran is saying. And then that discovery is proven to be maybe not quite as good as we once thought it was, or it's overturned later. Now what you've done? You've proven the Quran wrong. So there's a lot of worry about that and saying, we can't rely on outside sources. This is the source of all truth. That stuff might be convenient in our daily lives, but let us not forget that this is the source of ultimate truth. And so that got carried to an extreme level, where it was, therefore, all these things can be bad. And that stagnated scientific development and I think philosophical development in the Islamic world. Now, I want to be fair. I don't think this is actually accurate, but if someone who is still a Muslim was sitting on the other side of this table, they might say, well, what really stagnated it was white Western colonialism and the Roman Empire and then the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and they're the ones who stagnated it. I don't think that's actually historically accurate, but I want to make sure that that's a view that's out there. So I don't want to present only one side of it. That's a view that's out there. Yeah. But I do think that there was, and even today, you find it today, in the Salafi movement. So the Salafis are like, go back to the original, the Islam of Muhammad, so to speak. And they're a minority position, but they're very powerful. And in fact, they can become violent. So for example, they persecute Shia Muslims quite a bit because that's an innovation. It's a sect of Islam, but it's an innovation. They will... those are the ones who form ISIS and who form all these Islamic terrorist groups, can come out of the Salafi tradition. Not all Salafis are like that, but some of them can be. My point is that group actually has sort of a reactionary view on innovation in science, even today. Like in the 21st century, we have people who have a disdain for these kinds of things because it suggests innovation and elevating something to the level of authority of the dictation of God's word in the Quran. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge part of it. Yeah. And it still persists.
Yeah. So that wouldn't necessarily be a fundamental worldview issue then. It's more maybe an interpretive movement or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because the hard part, because what you have is you have this tension with what the Quran actually seems to be saying, which is like, for everyone, Muslims or non-Muslims alike, there are clear signs that seem to suggest that Allah is God. And if that's the case, there's an implication that you should look up what those signs actually are. In other words, one might get the impression that from the text that those things exist and you don't understand them, and that's enough. You don't understand them, and your effort to understand them is an effort to play God, and so get away from that. Those are signs. Stars in the sky, mountains that the Quranic text seems to suggest that they form the pillars of the stability of the earth, which we now know is actually the opposite. But those things are signs of God's power and God's majesty. And so some would say, don't even look into that stuff because you're trying to play God. Others would say, well, the Quranic text implies you should look into it because if it's a sign, how do you know it's a sign unless you get impressed by it?
Yeah.
So there's this tension.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, that leads us to, I think, the next thing I want to discuss, which is the common ground that exists between Christians and Muslims regarding really scientific arguments for God's existence, something that as I got into Christian apologetics, again, working in the arena of science, I began, because of my name, began to encounter a lot of Muslims who really liked the work that I was doing, right?
Yeah.
And I have a lot of people that follow me on social media that are my social media friends that are from the Islamic world who thankfully, promote my work, right? Right. And I had the privilege of going 3 years in a row to Istanbul, working with a group of Islamic creationists, putting on conferences on scientific evidence for God's existence, and we agreed to do that because it opened up some really incredible opportunities just to talk about Christianity. I've got a friend who has a YouTube channel, Finding Truth, Ahmed Esra from Egypt, who, he and I share we're almost kindred spirits in terms of our view of science and the evidence that comes from science. So to me, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's a place of common ground. But again, it leads me to ask some questions because in Christianity, that idea that there's scientific evidence for God's existence naturally flows out of the text. God has made himself known to us through the record of nature, right? This is part of God's revelation to us.
Right.
And yet in Islam, my understanding is God is unknowable.
Yeah.
And so again, I see what appears to be naively a contradiction, probably more attention. But to me this is interesting because both Christianity and Islam would view God as being personal and transcendent.
Yes.
And so endemic in that view of God is God is hidden from us, right?
Yeah.
When people complain about God's hiddenness, to me it's like, well, of course God is hidden because he's transcendent, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But what's radical, I think, in Christianity is God has chosen to make himself known to us. And not only that he exists, but something about who he is, independent of the Old and the New Testaments, right?
Yeah.
Through creation, through what's written on our hearts, right? Through God's providential care, even through human nature because we're image bearers. And so this idea of having scientific evidence for God makes a lot of sense to me in a Christian perspective, but I'm somewhat bewildered at times about how Muslims could embrace that same evidence with that same vigor, maybe even more vigor than evangelicals and other Christians.
Yeah, so that's interesting you say it that way because I think it's at least a tension, if not a contradiction. It's at least a tension. So a good friend of mine, Richard Schumack, wrote a really great book. The title is interesting all by itself. It's called The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity. Now, he's a Christian. He's a Christian philosopher. And what he's trying to actually point out is that he's using that and he juxtaposes those ideas to say, really, Christianity has such wisdom in the way it's actually expressed that it actually instantiates the things that Muslims wish were true about Islam. So one of the things he talks about is there's a lot of these ideas about signs, and these things are predictors not predictors, they're signposts to God, that Allah is God. But one of the things that Richard points out, and others have pointed this out as well, is one, you look at the Islamic sources on commentaries on the Quran, and as I think I quoted before, is the one thing you can know about God is that you can't know God. That's a Muslim saying that. Now, there are certain strands of Islam, the Sufis, for example, which are very mystical, who think that's the whole point of Islam is to know God and to become almost consumed by him, like a moth is consumed by a flame. But that's a minority position, and it's not considered necessarily mainstream or orthodox. So we want to deal with sort of the mainstream and orthodox is they can't know about God. They can't know him intimately. So the Quran suggests, and the Muslim sources suggest, that there are signs in creation that point to God's existence, but you don't really know anything about the character of that God other than he's powerful and he's creative, and you should submit. Those are the three things you can know, essentially, as I read the sources. Those are the three things you can know about God, but that's knowing about God, but it's not knowing God. Right. And that's the fundamental difference. In a Muslim perspective, you can know about God, but you can't ever actually know him. There's no level of transcendent, immanence. And I don't mean immanence in terms of it's inevitable. I mean like presence. Yeah. You can't really have that with God in Islam because he's so wholly other that there's no way to bridge the gap between us and him. So it is mystifying. There is a tension there, and I think it's something we can bring up with our Muslim friends. But your other point is well taken as well. Is that but given the sort of mystifying nature of it, why are Muslims so eager to point to scientific evidence as if it validates God's existence? Here's how I've wrestled with this myself. Here's how I've come to view it. Yeah, looking back at my own experience too, because I used to use like the Quran says this and science says this now. There's no way Muhammad could have known that in 7th century Arabia, and yet we know it now. And so that's evidence that this must have come from God. And there's a number of issues with that. But one of the reasons why I think I can do that, I did that as a Muslim, is that in a Muslim mind, I think what this does is if you can show that science, that there are signs of something transcendent. You don't need to be a Muslim to believe that this world appears to be designed and the design appears to work really, really well and things seem to fit well. And so there's this sort of natural theology that Muslims would aspire to and ascribe to. And that shows you that a God exists. Now the question is it this particular God? And the Quran seems to suggest that there are signs that show you that Allah, the God of the Quran, is God. The text doesn't actually give you a good reason to believe that. Like, why not just a God? Why this particular one? What a Muslim might say back, whether this is a good argument or not is not the issue. What they might say back is, well, the Quran is God's revealed text, and if it says things that only God could have known at the time, then it shows you that the Quran is God's revealed will. And so you can know God to only the extent the Quran tells you about him. So you see how it works is like I can know him in a limited sense, a very limited sense, in terms of I can know his will. Muslims have said, numerous Muslims have said, that God is not in Islam so much a person to be encountered, but as a will to be obeyed. Yeah. Now they believe God is a person, and in other words, he has personhood and personality, but they don't believe that we can actually know him personally. We just know his will. So the argument goes like this. Creation is ordered. Creation couldn't have gotten here by itself. Something had to create it. There are signs within that creation that point to the Quran, and the Quran points to who God is. Yeah. And that's how you get there. Yeah. I think is a fundamental contrast to the way a Christian would look at it. And you laid it out so beautifully. I would say there's one additional step is when in Hebrews we read the verse that says that in various times and in diverse ways God has revealed himself to us through his prophets, but in these last days he's revealed himself to us through his Son. Right. So not only do you have creation, not only do you have the book of nature, as it were, that reveals to us that a God exists, then you have the teleological arguments that show that choices were made. Yeah. So you have a personal God, not just a force of creation, but a personal God. And then you have the moral argument, which shows us that a moral God exists. And then you have various reasons why you can see in the scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, that this particular God exists. And then you have in the revelation of God through his Son what it's like to know him personally. Yeah. And so the funnel gets more and more specific in Christianity. So science and historical inquiry and philosophy all meld together to give us a very specific picture of a God who's chosen to bridge the unbridgeable gap. Right. Whereas Islam leaves us with God exists, it's an unbridgeable gap. And that's all there is to it. Yeah. So I think personally, this is speculation on my part, Faz, but I can tell you from my own experience as a Muslim, the effort to justify God's existence or to argue for God's existence through the Quran and through other means and use science to do that is an attempt to actually know God. And even if the sources don't allow you to know God, there's the human desire to want to know him.
Yeah.
And so this, I think, is the beautiful bridge where the work you guys do, for example, and the partnerships you guys have will allow you to satisfy an affinity that Muslims have.
Right.
They love science. They love the created order. They love all this stuff. And there's an inherent need to want to know God.
Right.
But there's this barrier, it seems. But
Right.
the Bible and science, and when you see the compatibility, it breaks that barrier. And I think that's a tremendous good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting to me. I almost am hesitant to bring up this point because what you just described there was so beautiful and so powerful, you know, and I hope I don't detract from that.
No.
But you know, it's interesting to me, and I want to be very careful when I say this, but I do actually see some similarities in what you're describing and our friends at the Discovery Institute who are promoting intelligent design, where they're very careful as a movement to say, look, the evidence points to design. We're really agnostic or silent on who we think that designer is. Now, personally, people will acknowledge that they're Christians, that they hold, some of them hold to an old earth perspective. So they're open about that. But as a movement, and you know, and as I've read their content and interacted with some of the people in the Discovery Institute who I consider to be friends, you know, oftentimes they'll say, well, the nature of who God is theological. It's not really scientific. But, you know, I would disagree with that. And I would also maybe challenge my Muslim friends in this way too, is that I don't think science just simply tells us that there is a transcendent personal God, but I think we can even go further and determine who that God very well might be. And the reason I say that is because when I look at archaeology or when I look at the work of SETI, and I've actually modeled an argument for God's existence from what archaeologists do and what SETI does, you know, in terms of the criteria they use to establish the work of intelligent agency.
Right.
So, for example, an archaeologist will pick up a rock and say, well, this rock clearly was shaped by some kind of quote-unquote intelligent agent, a hominin, right, as opposed to natural forces. And there are ways in which they kind of check off boxes to draw that conclusion. But then they can go one step further and they say, well, we can actually tell you something about the capabilities of this hominin, what its cognitive abilities were, what its manual dexterity was. We can even get insight into its motivations. Why was it making this tool? What was it being used for? So science isn't really limited to just saying there's a designer. It actually tells us quite a bit about who that designer is. And I think by similar token, you know, to say that there is a beginning to the universe, well, that means there must be a transcendent cause. There's design, that means it must be personal. When you go to biology, you see, you know, these shared designs. There's a universality to life at a molecular level, cellular level, anatomical and physiological level. So that suggests there's probably a single designer, not a cohort of designers to respond to one of David Hume's criticisms, right? You know, we see constancies in the laws of nature. That suggests something about the character of God being unchanging, right? You know, and so you can begin to see where I'm going with this, that it actually is telling us something about God's nature. And then, of course, there's this really eerie, you know, I think it's eerie at least, this eerie resonance between what we do as human designers and what we see in nature. And the more that we study, particularly biochemistry, the more and more we're seeing this relationship between human technology and biochemical designs, where our technology helps us to interpret what's going on inside the cell. And then what we see inside the cell is inspiring new technology. That suggests that there's something about us that we share with God, right?
Which goes back to that made in his image thing, which, by the way, is not an Islamic idea.
Right.
It would be considered almost blasphemous to say we are made in his image. I think it's not blasphemous, but because they misunderstand it, but it's not an Islamic idea.
Right.
So I think that distinction is really important to make, is that what you're leading to is so specifically, I love the way it does lead you to, Peter Berger has this wonderful phrase, signals of transcendence. I love that phrase because it sounds like crystals falling. Signals of transcendence, it doesn't give you the whole picture, but it's a signal of it.
Right.
So we have to be careful, of course, to do a sort of Christian version of scientism where science explains everything.
Right.
Because theology does play a part into it. I mean, I love the fact that Ken Samples is one of your scholars here, and he's a theologian and a philosopher, and he thinks through these things. You have this queen of sciences, and you have hard sciences putting them together. I love the way you said that just now. I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I was so impressed with the whole idea of there's that our technology allows us to see the created order, and then the created order inspires our technology. And what a reciprocal way to think of us as made in God's image. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I guess my point is that, oftentimes I'll hear, well, why would you say it's the God of the Bible, right? And so this is why, is that science directs us in that way. And there's things that we can also to infer, like God must love us because of his providential care. It's remarkable to me that built into creation, are things that we would need. Why is it that you can go to a rainforest in the tropics, find a rare plant, and isolate compounds from there that just happen to be ideal to treat cancer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's stuff like that. It's not, and this isn't an oddity. This is,
it's prevalent.
It's prevalent,
Yeah.
right? There's a whole branch of, pharmacology now called ethnopharmacology, where you're relying on the insights of indigenous people to develop new medicines.
Yeah.
But that insight is coming from the fact that they're utilizing these plants that have compounds in them that actually have efficacy in treating diseases.
Yeah, the implication of provision, of intentional provision, is hard to avoid.
Yeah.
Right. It just seems like this has been provided for you.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about Hebrews chapter 11. And oftentimes we have this. Depending on your version of the Bible, it gets a little bit. It becomes almost a weapon against Christianity. The whole, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, which I think is the King James version of it. But you have, I think, better translations which say, like the ESV, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Not the evidence of things not seen, but the conviction of things not seen. And then what I love is the way the writer to the Hebrews, completes this and keeps going on with this. For by faith, the people of old received their commendation. And then he says this: by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, kalam, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. I find that to be not a developed cosmology, but a sophisticated idea of cosmology, is that what we do see was made by things that aren't seen. If you look at the standard model for the Big Bang, the standard model of the universe's creation, matter, energy, space, and time can't create themselves. So the thing that creates everything is immaterial, enormously powerful, spaceless, and timeless. It sounds like the things that matter, energy, space, and time, the things that were created or that were seen, were made out of things that were not seen or not visible. It sounds remarkably close to what the standard model actually teaches.
Yeah.
And even if the model is wrong, you still have the idea of God being a necessary being, philosophically speaking. So my point in bringing this up is that the scriptures are so helpful and specific about the kind of God you would expect to see if the universe were created by God. And then the science seems to point us in this direction. So it's not just any old God. It's a specific kind of God. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and again, that specificity to me is intriguing in light of Islam's claims, in light of our claims of our friends at the Discovery Institute, right? In light of the challenges that skeptics will level our way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that leads us. That reading that passage in in pointing out its connection to really Big Bang cosmology, leads us to really the next topic and the final point of discussion, and that is, the scientific accuracy of the Old and New Testaments and the scientific accuracy of the Quran, right? And of course, I work for an organization where our bread and butter is showing that Scripture is scientifically accurate, and that we look for, we proudly embrace the label of a concordist, which is someone who looks for kind of the concordance between the discoveries of science and what we see in the creation accounts. Yeah. And this idea is controversial among Christian theologians for some good reasons. I wouldn't say obvious, but for some good reasons. But yet I think it is possible, if you're responsible and you're careful, to really recognize that the Bible isn't a science book, but when it does make reference to things that are under the purview of science, the concepts in Scripture seem to be spot on and harmonize with what we see in science. In some instances, almost anticipate what science has discovered. And of course, that gives us confidence that Scripture is true. And so the question is, does the Quran enjoy that same level of scientific accuracy? And my friend, Ahmed Eshra, who again has the channel Finding Truth, he's a remarkable person, very bright, extremely well read, and it's not unusual for him to. He has a lot of the Quran memorized. He'll just from memory in Arabic recite a surah and then or a passage from a surah, and then will expound upon it and show. Wow, it seems like the Quran displays this scientific accuracy. Yeah. And I met when I was in Istanbul an Italian scholar who converted from Catholicism to Islam, and when I asked him why, he said, "Well, the scientific accuracy of the Quran." So that concept is out there. Yeah. And so the question is, is the Quran really scientifically accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's something that can be impressive. One of the most seminal books on this was by a French doctor named Maurice Bucaille. Yeah. I don't know how to say his name, actually, his last name. So for our French-speaking friends, I probably murdered that. But he has this book called Science, the Bible, and the Quran, and all this. And he talks about this long thing about how all these things seem to suggest that the Quran has this scientific accuracy. And the issue isn't just that it has accuracy, it's that it has accuracy unknown to the scientists or to the thinkers of the day. Yeah. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment here. The Quran is actually revealed, according to Muslims, 700 years after the Christian era starts. So you have 700 years of an accumulated knowledge. You're going to have a couple of things that are going to be borrowed. You're just going to have that. But some of the things aren't all that impressive. And a lot of Muslims are starting to acknowledge this, by the way. In fact, a lot of academic Muslims really don't go here anymore. In fact, I was talking to my friend Richard Schumack about some of the recent turns in popular apologetics with Islam. There's a guy named Ali Dawa who has a popular YouTube channel. And he basically says Muslims start to steer away from using science to confirm the Quran because I think he's been made uncomfortable by some recent discoveries that suggest that it's not so accurate after all. So what he says is, and I get the argument, I totally get it. He's saying, look, science is provisional. And what he means by that, I think, is in the right sense of the word provisional. But science is provisional. People hold these conclusions provisionally because new theories, new ideas, new things will come to light that either will debunk the old theory or modify it. And so if you're relying on a provisional thing to understand a unchanging, non-provisional book, you're going to get contradictions at some point, and then those things, if those are the evidences you use to bolster the Quran, when they change, they can be used to debunk it. And so I understand the argument, and it's more of a tactical thing, but it's becoming increasingly uncomfortable with this kind of thing. And tacit in his discomfort is the fact that modern science is sort of showing that maybe some of the things we thought were accurate aren't, or there is concordism within Islam, and there's a lot of it, a ton of it, where Muslims will read something And it's not bad. I'm not against concordism. The overuse of it is the issue, as we've talked about before, is when you take something and you read into a text something it's not actually saying so that it sounds scientific. The example I get is when in the story of ants that are in the path of Solomon. Solomon is marching, and ants actually get out of the way. They talk to each other, and they say, Solomon's coming, we have to move because he'll crush us. And so, see, that's a prediction of the way ants communicate, through pheromones and these kind of things. And this is a discussion. This is a clear sign of something scientific that no one knows. Well, I have two responses to that. First, anybody who's observed ants for 5 minutes, just by observing them, knows they communicate. I mean, there's a colony, for heaven's sake. It's not like, spiders that just live alone, and not all of them do, but that live alone and, all that. And they clearly have a path, and they clearly have a destination, and they eat the food, and they transport the food. It doesn't take a genius to know ants communicate. But this passage is not meant to communicate the idea of how they communicate. It's just giving a very fable-like story where do the ants really communicate and think that's a human? I've rationalized my idea that that's a human being, that human being has a name, by the way, and that human being will crush us if we let him, if we stay in his path. Ants don't think that way. And so if it's being proposed as a scientifically accurate way to think about ant communication, it's inaccurate. Rather, the more charitable way to look at that from the Quranic standpoint is that it's not meant to convey anything scientific. So it's not a contradiction because it's not meant to convey something scientific.
Right.
But that's the kind of concordism you see oftentimes with Muslims, I think, who are overzealous to show that the Quran says something scientific when it doesn't. And Christians are guilty of the same thing, oftentimes.
Yes.
But I think that the Bible has more of a justification for believing that. Like I've heard you say, and I look at it more and more, and I'm more and more impressed with biomimetics, the idea that we solve engineering problems by looking at nature, and then you see in Job chapter 12 this whole thing. But look at the beasts of the air, the beasts and the birds of the air, and they will teach you. And like, well, my goodness, right? That's pretty impressive. But there are inaccuracies as well that I think have to be contended with. Muslims have to contend with these things, and they're starting to. Example is, I was looking up just now the specific reference in the Quran, and so I couldn't find it fast enough, but it's in one of the 80s, in one of the 82 or 86, one of the surahs of the Quran, where it describes embryology and birth and where human beings come from. And the verse, this is a paraphrase, is something, does man not know from what he comes? He is created from a drop emitted from between the backbone and the ribs.
Right.
That's not true. I mean, it's just not. There's nothing from between the backbone and the ribs that emits anything that results in a human being. And so that seems to be just a scientific problem.
Right.
The response, by the way, has been from a lot of Muslims is the words for backbone and ribs are tara'ib up here, the backbone and the ribs, and sulb. The ribs are tara'ib and the sulb is the backbone. And these mean masculine and feminine. So a human being is created from something emitted from between the masculine and the feminine and all that. Well, I have two responses to that. First, I don't think it really means that. Second, let's say it does mean that. There's two problems. The first problem is that that's not a scientifically accurate, that's not a scientific statement that no one knew. Everyone knows human beings come from between men and women.
Right.
So it's not that impressive of a statement.
Right.
Maybe it wasn't intended to be.
Right.
But if it was intended to be an impressive statement, it's not that impressive.
Right.
Second, human beings are not created from a drop emitted from between them.
Yeah.
It's the union of something in one person's body, not in both their bodies or not between their bodies.
Right.
So there's some pretty serious issues there. The Quran describes the sun setting in a pool of muddy water as an example. The Quran describes mountains as being pillars upon which the stability of the earth is dependent. Well, we now know that mountains are actually created by tectonic shifts, which is the instability of the crust of the earth. So these are things Muslims have to contend with and try to understand. And if they say, okay, this is a factual statement, well, then you have to deal with the fact that science seems to suggest it's not. And by the way, that tectonic plates thing, that's not provisional. No one thinks, hey, we're going to find something that's going to radically shift our view of plate tectonics. That's the way it is. So Muslims have to contend with that. And maybe the answer is those weren't meant to be scientific statements.
Right.
Great, then stop saying they are.
Right.
And if they're not, okay, I can live with that. They seem to suggest very factual things.
Right.
So there's some issues there. I think there are some, and we're trying to be as sensitive as we possibly can, because this is a sacred text to billions of people,
Right.
or at least 1.5 billion. It kind of depends on who you ask. But at the same time, these are challenges that Christians have been able to face for a long time. And a sort of a denouement to this sort of rant that I'm on right now is the Christian faith allows for you to actually take a look at the scriptures, examine them, and either say, look, I have a problem with this, and wrestle with it. And when I say Christian faith, I mean Christendom, historically. We've had our heretics burned at the stakes, and we've had that stuff. I mean, we're not perfect, not even close. But I think, especially in modern Christendom, we have this ability to question the text itself, or to see maybe that lines up with something, or maybe we're reading too much into it. We have that freedom to do it. I think that Muslims need to foster that level of freedom amongst themselves, to be able to take a look at their text and say, what does it really mean? Are we taking it too far? Is our zealousness to propagate Islam going too far, or are we just wrong about some stuff? I think you'll have a surge forward, I think, in satisfaction. It'll be uncomfortable. These things are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But you have to be willing to be uncomfortable in order to find us to complete your search for truth, or to actually continue on your search for truth.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this has been a fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
At least for me, it has.
Me too.
And I appreciate that. And I think maybe, if I have a closing thought, I'd love to hear your summation maybe. I've come to appreciate over the years, just from a Christian perspective, how complex trying to interact with science can be, because it involves issues with biblical interpretation, theology, philosophy, science, the philosophy of science, the discoveries of science, as you point out, the provisional nature of science. And very good people can reach very different conclusions. So it's not an easy exercise. And I think as Christians, we want to extend the same grace towards Muslims.
Yes, indeed.
And I know, again, I've just discovered that there's real friendships that can develop between Christians and Muslims when you seek common ground relating to science. There's a lot of points of agreement. And when that common ground is discovered, I find that it becomes much less threatening to talk about differences and in productive ways. That's just been my experience.
I agree with you. And if I were just to take a self-interested view on this, and I hesitate to actually add to that because that was really quite good. But I think in a self-interested way, some of the most brilliant thinkers and innovators and scientists of our day are Muslims. And so to build walls would just be self-destructive. We need to benefit from their insight. We need to benefit from their intelligence. We need to have an exchange of ideas. And if we build walls, and religious walls are very tough to scale once you create them. Theological walls are very tough to scale once you create them. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not differences. Of course there are. But I don't like the idea of building walls just for wall's sake. Rather, we come and we build platforms upon which we can both stand. Now, that doesn't mean we agree on everything. My metaphor isn't necessarily a bridge, it's a platform. So we build a common platform, and we're going to jump off now. And there are various pools of water, sort of like a high dive act. There are various pools of water we can jump into. Some pools have no water whatsoever, and some pools don't have enough. I would suggest only one pool has enough water. And what we do with our Muslim friends is that we come on this common platform of a belief that God can be knowable in some degree, some sense. And science is a method by which we can know something about the created order and share some information together, then we can build that common platform together and then look down and say, which pool has the water? And so we actually walk to the edge of the platform together and then jump together, hopefully, into the one pool that has enough. Yeah. But the platform has to be built first. And that's why I love the endeavor of taking objective things, whether it's from, things that are, and I realize it's provisional, but things that can be known, physics, chemistry, biology, and come together on these things, build this platform, stand together and say, we found the pool. That's the one pool. Let's jump into that one.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Abdu. This has been a lot of fun.
A pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of Star Cells and God. Love to hear your comments. So take advantage of the comment section and just let us know what you think, what your ideas are, how you react to our conversation. Also, remember that if you want to get more videos like this, go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, and subscribe. Use the notification button so that you're alerted when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops. And also remember, your favorite podcast app can be used to subscribe to Star Cells and God as well. Remember to share this video with your friends. And finally, I just want to close with this well-known statement: the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe. Until next time.